the new picture, you're going over to the deep, dark continent to make.
Yes, we're going over to Africa, probably down around Nairobi and northern Rhodesia. Incidentally, we just found out it was raining there, so we may have to shoot it in Scotland. I don't know.
Name of the new picture?
African Queen.
Movies are like souffles. They either rise or they don't. And people seldom are able to predict or tell you why. The African Queen is an improbable cinematic triumph made against seemingly insurmountable odds and comprising a bunch of disparate, desperate characters who, saving the movie business, would probably not even be in the same world, let alone the same room with each other.
There's something special about the film immediately. It's still a film that has an enchantment about it. It's exciting, and a lot of it has to do with the relationship with Bogart and Hepburn, the way they play off one another.
That's one of the great charms of the African Queen. It's played by adults, not kids pulling a boat through water.
African Queen is a classic.
It's one of the best films. It's the sort of film that is shown constantly.
This is an independent film. In those days, this was the time of the big studios. But either the studios made it and distributed it, or where were you?
You've got to remember that making films on location was not the norm.
You know, the thought of going to Africa to shoot a fictional film with actors and full crews was not something that was looked upon as a reality.
I don't think anybody in Hollywood would have ventured to do that except for John Huston.
He always seemed to have a feeling for places that were exotic, wild.
Huston got the big picture, and in order to make The African Queen with all its dramas, you needed to get the big picture.
I think when you watch this movie, there's no question. They're in Africa. This is really happening. And you can just imagine what was going on outside the frame.
The African Queen had been written as a novel in 1935 by C.S. Forester.
Forster was a major popular writer of that time.
He was not a great author, but he was a very good craftsman and storyteller.
He wrote wonderful books that I loved as a boy about Captain Horatio Hornblower.
A very, very complicated, not to say elusive character. In the first place, his name was not C.S. Forester.
When he wrote an autobiography, he wrote it so you could never tell where he came from. And the name of Forrester was chosen for him by a local typist who typed up his first novel.
The African Queen wasn't a big high adventure as much as it was the story of these two incongruous people on this little 30-foot rig.
It had been published in 1935, I think, and then it had been hanging around Warner's for a good 6 or 7 years.
And Betty Davis was interested in doing it.
RKO had wanted to do a version of it with Charles Laughton and his wife Elsa Lanchester. So now it's 1950. Warner's had given up on it.
And also Alexander Korda, who said, who wants to see a pair of old people going up and down an African river? You'll be bankrupt.
Well, then enter S.P. Eagle, Sam Spiegel.
Sam Spiegel was overbearing.
Charm as a devil.
He had no moral conscience.
Spent some time in jail.
And spoke 9 languages.
Heavyweight boxer.
Extremely controversial.
He just had 2 problems, money and women.
He was convinced that unpleasantness was what was called for in a producer. A producer was not meant to be nice.
All these elements combined in one man is necessary to be a good producer, and Sam had them all.
The projects that his name is attached to, the pictures that he's made, he seemed to really love movies and produce some extraordinary films, including, just to mention a few, On the Waterfront, Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai, of course.
Sam Spiegel had come to Hollywood with very little.
He did his first picture, as you know, Tales of Manhattan, as S.P. Eagle.
The American Eagle, right? And then later on, of course, he went back to his Spiegel. But for a while there, it was S.P. Eagle.
And there are people now say to me that was his real name. Spiegel wasn't his real name, which is ridiculous.
He fled the sheriff, he fled Nazis, he fled everything. He was chased out of Berlin because of Hitler and arrived in San Francisco and was put in prison because he was pretending to be an Egyptian official. And he was so quick on his toes, as Kazan said about Spiegel. He said, this is a man who could be dropped naked without a penny, and the next day he would be having lunch in the best hotel.
At one point at a party or dinner, he saw John Huston and asked him, if you had your druthers, what story would you pick to make?
And it's worth noting that all John Huston's movies are based on books.
Stories The Maltese Falcon, of course, Treasure of Sierra Madre,
Moby Dick or Moulin Rouge,
The Asphalt Jungle, and Remarkable Man Who Would Be King.
They are all based on literary sources. And at this dinner party, John Huston apparently mentioned The African Queen,
which had the advantage of having been written so long ago that the rights were very easy and very cheap to get.
So Spiegel says, let's form a company, John. I'll do this. I'll make African Queen with you. I'll get the money.
He secured the rights of the African Queen. And then he went to Bogart and said, John Huston is directing the African Queen for me, and he would like you to star, and I would like you to star. Would you do it? And Bogart said, sure. Then he said, what would you say? Who would be a good co-star for you? He says, I never worked with Katharine Hepburn. That would be an interesting combination. So then Spiegel went to Katharine Hepburn and said, I've got John Huston directing, Bogey starring, will you co-star? And she said, absolutely. So now he had absolutely no money to make this film.
Sam Spiegel was not the financier of the movie. He rounded up the money.
In those days, with the beginnings of the breakup of the studio system, financing was always difficult.
Money had fallen through endlessly. There was Walter Heller, a guy from Chicago bringing in money, and then Spiegel met up with the Wolf Brothers, Romulus Films.
My brother was in Hollywood at the time, and we started two companies, Romulus Films, to produce films, and Independent Film Distributors, which was to distribute films throughout the world that we financed. But we found that it was very difficult to get really good independent films. In fact, we lost on various films that we were able to get at that time. And so we decided that we had to go in for production for ourselves. And we set up The African Queen to be made in this country and in Africa. It was the time of the Un-American Activities Committee, if you remember, Senator McCarthy. And there were a number of top Hollywood directors who were unhappy staying in Hollywood. So I asked my brother to go back there and see if there were any projects that we would be able to make in this country.
John Huston, Katharine Hepburn, and Humphrey Bogart were all, to a greater or lesser degree, involved with what were in the early 50s perceived as left-wing or leftist or communist ideologies or activities.
The backstory, the context of The African Queen really is the political strife that was going on in Hollywood.
In 1947 is when the House of Un-American Activities Committee was getting going. They figured that the film industry was ripe because you don't want communists in the film industry.
And so many of these people had to leave. Others were prevented from working.
Huston, Bogart, Bacall, other movie stars who were part of this committee for the First Amendment went to Washington believing that they were going to set everybody straight on how patriotic they were. And as Lauren Bacall said, they really hadn't a clue the propeller into which they had walked.
And it's very problematic within the studio because everyone fears that if Bogart any actor is tarnished by this, then it has nothing to do with what's right or wrong. It's that the films are not going to make money. And so there's a great fear that his luster as a star will go down.
I think Hepburn was too big of a star to actually have been blacklisted, though there was considerable talk and was in the newspapers that she was going to be subpoenaed.
My name came up because I did a speech about censorship. That was in the Gilmore Stadium. And like a silly, I thought of wearing a white dress, and then I thought they'd call me the Dove of Peace. So I wore a pink dress and had right in their hands.
The idea of leaving town, of going someplace, and moreover, of having Bogart and Hepburn play super patriots who were going to do Mission Impossible on this rickety little boat to torpedo the German gunboat and raise the Union Jack, even if it wasn't the Stars and Stripes.
All three were very shrewd characters. They knew what they needed to do, and what better project than The African Queen?
John Huston was for all his kind of rough and tumble ways, was a very literate person, very well read, and had great admiration for writing. And one of the people who worked with him on the adaptation of this was James Agee, who had written Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and had established a career as a very literate writer about films and in film criticism.
James Agee was essentially a disheveled drunk with a kind of poetic gift for language.
He was a most remarkable character, remarkable looking. He was big, great rush of hair which I speak from envy.
His way in with Huston was he wrote a Life magazine article called Undirectable Director.
And then they struck up a rapport and a kind of a mutual admiration society. It was only a matter of time until Huston began thinking of Agee as a potential collaborator on his screenplay, and Agee began thinking of Huston as his conduit to Hollywood.
I said, well, how about doing a picture with me? And said he'd like nothing better. The first one I did, why? The African Queen.
Mr. Allnut.
I'm still right here, miss. There ain't much of any other place I could be on a 30-foot boat.
One of the key things besides Bogart and Hepburn, of course, is this extraordinary script by James Agee from the Forrester novel, and the kind of mixture of this romance, which is kind of blooming, and adventure story.
Agee gave The African Queen a lot of its early spark. He consciously modeled the characters portrayed by Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn on his own mother and his own father.
What an absurd idea.
What an absurd idea. What an absurd idea. Lady, you got 10 absurd ideas for my one.
And I think it's what gave it some of its magic and its special charm.
Agee was a big smoker, and they actually had a regime where they went to bed at 10 o'clock. They didn't drink that much,
We'd get up early in the morning and play a couple of sets of tennis, have breakfast, and then go to work. Work through until lunchtime, lay off for a couple of hours, and then work again for 2 or 3 hours, and another 2 or 3 sets of tennis, dinner, and after dinner we'd work. Jim was forever bringing more pages. He was doing an enormous amount of work, and I didn't see how he could manage to turn so much work out. And then I discovered that he was working at night and getting very little sleep.
And at one point, John left for a little while and was called back because James Agee had a heart attack.
I remember after he'd had his heart attack, we were alone in a room. It was 2 or 3 days after the heart attack. And Jim said, give me a cigarette. And I said, no. I said, Jim, it wouldn't be fair to the doctor. He thought about that, nodded. Right.
And that was the last time John talked to him. A year and a half later, Agee would die.
Smite the Amalekites, O Lord. Smite them, hip and thigh.
The great shame or tragedy was that he was so gifted in so many forms that if he had lived longer, we would have had more Agee, more of Agee's wonderful writing.
Before Huston and Company departed for Africa, the screenplay, the ending of the movie, was still being hotly debated.
When John Huston did The African Queen, it was to really shoot Africa, and apparently his obsession was to shoot an elephant. Katharine Hepburn, who was a control freak, was desperate to talk about her role with John Huston, who perversely gave her a tour of his hunting gear. She was furious. And Bogart, who knew Huston pretty well, just said, that's the monster for you.
John Huston had the idea of doing the whole thing in Africa, and he said it was going to be so easy because we could make a mock-up of the African Queen for the main scenes on a raft and just drift along the Congo. We were going to start and do the film in Uganda, in Lake Victoria, which was British territory. And then Huston went out there, and I was on another film. I didn't go, and he said he didn't like that location. It was too pretty, too much like Maidenhead and so on. So he disappeared for a couple of weeks, and we wondered what had happened, whether he would been eaten by crocodiles or something.
When John got to the first location, before Katie Hepburn and Bogey arrived, he was told that the food was scarce. And so they got a hunter who said he was a hunter to go hunt game, bring in monkey, bring in pig or whatever. And every day they were eating. And so there was always food in the pot, there was always meat. And then one day...
The soldiers came and collected him. And we didn't know why for a few days, and then discovered that during that previous period, villagers had been missing. And this was why. He was furnishing meat for the pot.
And this guy was hung. He actually was hung for doing this a few days later.
It's absolute bullshit.
When we flew to Africa for the African Queen, we all left London from what was then Northolt Airport. The men are in coats and jackets and tweed things, and we're going, from England to Africa, which is, searingly hot.
We stopped in Rome, we stopped in Khartoum and landed in Nairobi. And much to John's fury, all his artillery was confiscated by customs. His ambition was, of course, to shoot an elephant. And it was explained to him that there were only 5 licenses a year were issued and there was a 5-year waiting list. And obviously that didn't suit John at all. I think he met a Belgian at the bar that night, and John told him that he was very disappointed with Kenya, that he wanted to shoot an elephant, and the Belgian said, you want to go to the Belgian Congo? There you can shoot anything, whatever you like. Next morning, he had vanished. He'd taken a plane and had gone off to the Belgian Congo.
It was an incredible situation. Bogart, Katharine Hepburn, jumped on various planes and arrived in Africa to be told that Houston had gone off to shoot an elephant, which Katharine Hepburn said was an utterly piggish thing to do.
And about 2 days later, he returned. He said, "Kid, I found the location. It's really very interesting. I think you'll like it."
And it was right in nowhere land. It was called Biondo, this place, and it was beyond anywhere. It was 2 days jeep ride from Stanleyville.
There were 2 principal locations in Africa where the film was made. One was the Ruwiki River in the Belgian Congo, which is a very small river. They wanted narrow banks, and the water was pitch black.
Because of this underground foliage that had rotted and so forth and so on. And somehow this appealed to John Huston.
What a frightfully strong smell!
What smell?
The river. Smells like marigolds. Stale ones.
It does, huh? Not a very good smell for a flower.
The fact that he went on location to Africa to make The African Queen obviously had an effect on everybody there. The performance of Bogart and Katharine Hepburn would be night and day if they filmed this on a back lot somewhere. They were in the real place, and you can't fake that stuff.
We were in the middle of a leper colony. No hotels, and now we got to put the crew up. And the art director, Wilfred Shinkleton, who said, well, we've got to build one. And we built a sort of this shape, cabins, all the way around. Put up about 40 people, all made of bamboo and rattan on top.
To go to bed, you had to pull back the flap when we were in, as I said, the dormitory. Try to get your shoes off. Try and leap into bed before something came with you. And pull the net, because you had to sleep under nets.
You couldn't shoot on the African Queen because it's only about 16 foot long and about 5 foot wide. By the time you get the camera in there, which you do occasionally, where do you put the lights? The solution to that was another pontoon with bits of the African Queen. You had the stern, so that if you had Katie driving and Bogart sitting there, you could be the camera, and there was room for the lights.
And they had an African Queen. They bought an old boat, an old river boat there that was actually built in 1912, and they rechristened it the African Queen.
But now a Technicolor camera has loads of gear. There are the makeup and hairdressing. They've got their terrible little boxes, plus the props. We haven't got room for them on that, so we built another pontoon which has all the crew sitting on that are not working.
So you had this parade going down the river every day and shooting.
And then we had to pull Miss Hepburn's personal loo.
In her contract, apparently, she had a private loo, and so we had to improvise.
Which wasn't easy because the river, turned around. They're navigating all the floating flotillas.
And Taylor's Charlie is Katie's loo.
John Huston, who was doing it, didn't know a hell of a lot about river traffic. The current would take us careening down. We'd get swept way over to one side, and everybody would say duck, and we'd lie flat. Otherwise, we would have been scraped right into the crocodile pit or something.
It's really quite easy, isn't it, Mr. Allnut?
You got to learn to read the river.
We got not very far around the river. On the first bend, Katie's loo got hooked up on the trees. And so I yelled and shouted to the natives behind to chop it, and we'll pick it up on the way back.
Unfortunately, Miss Hepburn is very regular, and at 10 o'clock she said, "Where is my glue?" I then said, "Katie, I'm terribly sorry, we had to abandon it, dee-da. She didn't take very kindly to that, and I couldn't see why she couldn't do what the rest of the crew did, was to go whenever we were alongside into the bushes somewhere. We had no other sanitation.
And I'll just go up in the bow, hang off the anchor chain. You can stay back here in the stern and do whatever you have to. And so long as we don't look, it won't matter, huh?
Now, Houston sort of says, okay, I want you to understand one thing. We have to shoot this film in Technicolor. Now you may say, well, you know, this is a big deal. This is 1951. Most theatrical films at that time were still being made in black and white.
The Technicolor camera was a monster.
It has this huge blimp to be soundproofed, so it's a box, you know, about 4 foot tall and about 2 foot wide.
And inside this great soundproof box, 3 films ran through the camera.
You've got to open it all up and reload 3 reels of film.
It required immense amount of light.
Well, there ain't 2 hours of daylight left, miss.
We can go a long way in 2 hours, Mr. Olnut.
There's the color in the film, which is still very, very rich. Something very special about that true Technicolor. Of course, the movie, was shot by Jack Cardiff, who was probably the greatest of all Technicolor cameramen. You know, people know him now for the pictures he made with Paul Pressburger, like, of course, The Red Shoes and A Matter of Life and Death and Black Narcissus.
I said to the producer in London that I wanted to take 2 lamps to Africa with me, with a baby generator. And he said, Jack, he said, we're going to Africa in the sun. He said, you don't need lamps in Africa. I said, well, believe me, sometimes you do, and it also helps to put a bit of light in the shadows, because the light is very strong and so on. So I was allowed to have my 2 lamps. Ironically, the first 2 weeks of shooting on African Queen, it rained every day. But we were able to shoot every day because I had my 2 lamps.
What are you doing?
What? I ain't doing nothing, miss.
Well, get out. This instant.
When we talk about Bogart and Katharine Hepburn being the only actors going to Africa, we had Lauren Bacall, who was Mrs. Bogart at the time, going not to be in the picture, but to be with Bogey. And of course, according to all accounts, she was a big help.
Where you are going to, Africa, Rhodesia, Nigeria, did you say?
Nairobi. Nairobi, yeah.
Do we have still cannibals, wild animals, stuff like that?
I don't think so.
There are wild animals, honey.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. I suppose there are crocodiles, all kinds. I'm not too familiar with the animal life of Nairobi.
I bet you he even promised you a leopard skin.
You know, I bet you he didn't.
How about that?
Nothing but mink. She wears nothing but mink.
She kind of made her own role there as the camp cook and nursemaid, as one after the other of the crew members got sick. They suffered dysentery and a few got malaria, and one of the crew members had an attack of appendicitis. And Bacall would take care of them, help them write their letters home, do whatever she could. And as she had done on Treasure of the Sierra Madre, she began also to help out cooking some of the meals.
That is one of the great, and I think fully truthfully so, one of the great romances of Hollywood.
I think she was devoted to him. Of course, I saw arguments, but not serious arguments. That's where the Miss Bacall comes in, because when they were having an argument, he would always call her Miss Bacall. But they were devoted to each other and the children.
Lauren Bacall, even though much his junior in terms of years, and is often seen as that he was sort of the father in the relationship. But as time went on, particularly when his alcoholism and his lifestyle started to wear more on him, she became more of a caretaker to him and became his sort of strength. You see that, of course, in all the stories in African Queen.
African Queen is one of my favorite Bogart movies for a number of reasons. One, it's him later in life taking on this very different character than he's ever played and doing it with great aplomb.
Houston, among others, propagated the notion that Bogart was a kind of an ordinary just guy if you saw him on the street or at a party or something, but then when the camera came on, something magical happened.
Bogart was a marvelous movie actor. I never saw him on stage, but he knew what to do with that camera. Knew how much and how little, and the camera loved him for it.
Could you make a torpedo?
Bogey, of course, was, he put on this big act. He was a tough guy, you know. I mean, he told me at the beginning about makeup, you know. He said, Jack, he said, see this face? It's taken me many years to get this, all these lines and crinkles in it. He said, that's the way I want it. Don't light me out and make me look like a goddamn, you know, I want to look like this. So I did it.
He never seemed to carry a script around. Most actors hang on to their script, like directors do, like drowning men hanging onto a lifeboat. But he never seemed to have a script. But he was always word perfect. I never saw him fluff a take, ever.
He was very much of a gent, very well born, frightfully good manners.
Not a tough guy.
Not at all. The exact opposite.
And people
The exact
constantly-
opposite. But he was one of the few actors, he really liked his profession. He really was proud of being an actor. He was doing what he wanted to do.
Bogey was always amenable. He'd ask you, when's my next shot? And I could figure that out perfectly well. You won't need you for a couple of hours, Bogey. And he would very quietly, not as you would have today, a motorboat come and take him back to his caravans and so, he would go and make himself a bed and go to sleep. Then you kick him and always the same outfit and that terrible cap. It didn't matter how dirty he got, that was part of the routine.
Humphrey Bogart and John Huston, the director, were sort of made for each other in many ways. Their attitudes towards life and their attitude towards their work was very similar. I mean, they were hard drinkers, hard livers.
Sunday afternoons, I was always sleeping one off.
John was much more wild. Bogey was more domestic.
He didn't mix into the Hollywood circuit. Of course, I didn't see very much of Bogey in Hollywood. Usually we were kicking around the world, some other place.
He obviously is greatly responsible for making a star out of Bogart, I think, with The Maltese Falcon, which was, of course, his own first full credit as director. But he also wrote High Sierra, the Raoul Walsh film made the same year at Warner Brothers, and those two were the breakthrough pictures for Bogart. So really, in a way, they helped make each other, I think.
Huston loves adversity. One of the things he loved about shooting Treasure of the Sierra Madre is they were up in the kind of badlands of Mexico, and that it was, he loved the tough circumstances for it.
You're going to find evidence of chaos in making of many great films. If a shoot goes smoothly and everybody gets along, and usually the movie's not very good. So,
well, the African Queen was that times 10. They're there in what was then the Belgian Congo, now Zaire, way upriver. And Huston is sort of almost crowing. He says, we have every known disease here and almost every known type of serpent. And he's thrilled about that.
I used to go out shooting in the mornings before we started shooting on the picture. We used to go out with the rifle in the mornings. And Katie took a very dim view of this. She said, John, this just doesn't go with the rest of your character. You're not a murderer, I know. And yet you go out and shoot these beautiful animals. And I said, well, Katie, you don't really understand, and you wouldn't unless you came with me and experienced it yourself. And she said, all right, I'll come.
I can't think why she went, presumably to discourage him.
As they're walking through the jungle, there's this giant grumbling. They were that close to the elephants, they heard the grumbling in the stomachs, and they realized they were downwind for up until this point, and the wind changed. And all of a sudden, there was a herd of elephants they were within 15, 20 yards of, and one of the bull elephants started to bellow. It turned around, and they started to charge. And John realized, my God, I almost lost, our star, our leading lady. That was it was very irresponsible.
In any case, from that moment on, Katie was veritable Diana of the hunt.
In actuality, Dad never shot an elephant. People often think that he was a braggart and inflated, but he was much more subtle than that. First of all, he thought it would be a crime to shoot an elephant, but no, it wasn't a crime, it was a sin. And this is a non-religious man saying it's a sin.
This is a man who refused to be bored.
In his early childhood, he was diagnosed with an enlarged heart.
He was basically dying. His doctors were saying, you can't move, you can't do anything. And all he wanted to do was get out. He was a kid. He would look out his window and he could see that there was like a river down a distance away. So what he did, he waited at night and he snuck out the window. What he didn't know the first time he jumped in the river was that the river turned into a waterfall.
I went underwater for a little while and then came out and discovered it was great sport.
And he had some kind of epiphany that far from avoiding danger, if he went right for it, somehow it would turn into nothing, which worked really well for him, but was kind of dangerous for other people.
He loved to tell stories of beautiful losers. Everybody in John Huston's movies are trying to do something and failing.
He kind of recognized the strange, unconscious urge, that part of humanity which makes you want to fail and has a defeat in your own makeup, you know. It's like man is his own worst enemy, and you can feel that in all of Huston pictures.
Whether it's finding gold in the treasure of the Sierra Madre, or stealing jewelry in the asphalt jungle, or Peachy and Danny and the Man Who Would Be King going off to be kings in Kafiristan, and that doesn't work. Ahab going after the whale. Nothing works.
And he doesn't seem prejudiced about it. He doesn't say this is a bad thing in this character. It's just part of being alive. It's being human. It's being a human being. African Queen, which is kind of almost an upbeat picture, the way he takes them to the brink of total disaster is extremely unusual.
What you being so mean for, miss? Man takes a drop too much once in a while. It's only human nature.
Nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we are put in this world to rise above.
We had a famous scene between Bogey and Katie, and John said, fine, print it. And she said, but you weren't watching. But I was listening. No, you weren't watching, said Katie, and this went on.
Dad usually knew, almost intuitively, whether the shot had gone right or not by the way that the actors sounded. What he would do is turn away, listen to the beat of the lines. I mean, we've gone through all the rehearsals, we've gone through the setup. Dad would just listen to the music of the words, and then at the end of the shot, he'd say to his cameraman, did you get it? And if the cameraman said, yes, sir, that was it.
His gold standard was take one. Now, most of us as directors do 2 or 3 takes. We give notes to the actors in between, but Huston did none of that. He'd do a quick rehearsal and say, let's go for it. He'd shoot it, do the cover and say, that's it.
The problem, I think, today that we do so many setups, they had setups, they locked in with that camera. They did camera moves, but they locked in, and once they had it, you had the world around them. You could feel the flies, you could feel the humidity, you know, the heat. You know, put the actors in there, and I quite, you know, once they got it set, how many takes could you do?
One of the uniqueness about his direction was that he would often let the actors work things out. He would tell them, go ahead and, you know, do what you want.
And then he tweaked. And he would tweak in such a way that the person wouldn't even know that they were being given an instruction.
In The African Queen, very famous situation with Katharine Hepburn. She doesn't like Charlie Allnut. She doesn't like this character that her character doesn't like. And she's playing it condescendingly and angrily and whatever for the first 3 days they're shooting.
In other words, you are refusing to help your country in her hour of need, Mr. Allnut?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way.
Just how would you put it, Mr. Allnut?
And John is picking this up, you know. He says, this is not the kind of relationship that's going to develop into a good relationship, and that's what has to happen in this movie. And so he calls her aside. He says, may I talk to you?
He said that he thought that she ought to be more of a lady.
And she took umbrage by that because she felt she was a lady.
She says, well, what lady?
He says, have you ever seen how Eleanor Roosevelt, who she always thought herself as an ugly woman, but when she visited people, she always had this smile on her face?
You see, he kept it really simple.
And Katharine Hepburn, in her book, The Making of the African Queen, says that was the single greatest piece of direction she has ever received. She got the character. It was immediate. She understood who Rosie was supposed to be.
And that's genius. That is what a great director does.
See, the key thing, as you know, is really trust with the actors. And you gain the trust of the actors. You trust them, too. And they feel protected. They feel they got a safety net. They feel enriched. You could try anything.
I had a moment of weakness.
Oh, well, now, if you're feeling weak, a day or 2 more here won't make any difference.
Oh, no. We'll go on. Thank heaven for your strength, John.
Katharine Hepburn, a woman who had invented herself several times over the course of her career. She'd been labeled box office poison and had come back with the Philadelphia story, but she'd worn out her welcome again. She was now going to corner the market on spinsters.
She was a unique individual. I don't know anybody like her. I mean, can you think of one soul who was in her area who was comparable?
People always talk about Summertime, David Lean's charming film that he made in Venice, as a first, great middle-age role, but it's really, I think, a few years earlier with African Queen.
This is the moment when she separates herself from her contemporaries and really becomes the great American institution that she became.
We were in a delightful part of Africa. It was new and exciting, and it was a joy. There were a few instances of people getting ill, some malaria even. On the whole, it was a very pleasant experience.
Most pictures are fun to work on. I mean, the conditions are, everybody's come out of the war. All the crew had all been in the war. They'd all slept in much worse conditions than we had. No problems.
One night, I remember the clapper boy coming and saying, "Coming home tonight with the African Queen." It was shipping water.
Overnight, it did fill up and sink.
So next morning, when we all go to work, there is the African Queen lying on its side in the mud, and the entire male unit and anybody else who was around were up there around the trees with ropes.
We had to get 30 of the crew, including Bogey, to help.
Pulling it back upright.
Have you ever heard of a jigger? Oh, well, don't.
Jiggers were sort of little worms that get between your toes. Bogey gets a jigger. And so he showed it to the doctor, and he said, "Can you take it?" And he said, no, you must not take it. It's an operation, because if you pull it out with tweezers, the head stays in, and then you get blood poisoning, etc. The houseboy will do it.
It was somebody in the crew who was East African and therefore knew about this sort of thing.
The thing is that he holds the back end of the jigger and he puts a hot cigarette, and the jigger goes, "Ow!" And that's the moment when you ought to pull it out. We thought it was absolutely fascinating. Bogey was lying on his stomach and he couldn't know what was happening behind. And great shout of triumph when the jigger came out. And Bogey had another.
Among countless other problems, the soldier ants.
One night, as Hepburn and Bacall were walking back to their tents, they started screaming, and they walked in and they realized that everything was just blanketed with soldier ants.
They march like an army, about 4 deep, and they keep their distances.
And if they go through like a hen house or something, the hens are gone.
They were in the clothing, they were just blanketing on the floor.
The art department very sensibly had the natives dig a trench all the way around, and if they were ever to attack, we would counter-attack. Or set the kerosene alight.
I remember that night of everybody's on the warpath, going up, burning and moving things.
They knew that they had to finish up at that location rather quickly because there was no getting around the soldier ants.
The second location in Africa was Uganda.
To do the scene of the school and the burning, etc., that was all done in Uganda. And from there, then we went up the Murchison Nile.
Murchison Falls and Lake Albert. That was where the Kennegan Louise was supposedly patrolling the lake.
Animals are plenty. That was one of the reasons for going to Lake Albert, because on the banks there are really big mothers.
Waiting for their supper, miss.
And when you wake them up, they come crashing down into the water. It's quite impressive. And also the bumps on the boat, because suddenly hippos come along.
I was writing away and the hippo rose underneath the boat. And John always tells the story, and she just went on writing, never even reacted. Well, he sort of lifted us up and he went down again, and we went down. Oh, yes, the hippos were there. The baboons were on the far side. They didn't attack us. No, they just used to come out and watch every day as we were shooting. I doubled for Katie, taking the boat when they're on the hill, the Germans shooting down. That's me steering the boat down there. And I went with the captain of the Lugard, who gave me one go round to the base of the thing where all the crocodiles are lying on the bank with their mouths wide open, and very large ones. You can't go left, you can't go right, you've got about a foot either side. And I was, of course, having to be down under the tiller. If I'd have gone aground, we didn't really have anything to push us off with except... I don't even think we did have a pole on the boat, but it was good fun.
Well, there ain't no use of us both going to do it. Now that I've had time to study it, I can plainly see it's a one-man job.
You couldn't be more right, Charlie, dear.
Well, now, Rosie, I'm glad you agree with me. When the time comes, I'll put you off on the East Shore. You'll wait there for me while I attend to the Louisa.
Certainly not. You're the one to be put ashore.
Me?
The screenplay was actually written by Agee and by John Huston. And at the end, because they were unable to find a satisfactory ending, another Hollywood screenwriter named Peter Vertel
was brought over to Africa briefly to work on the revision of the script.
In the original C.S. Forester novel, they don't succeed.
My father was a pessimist, and he didn't think things should go right. The African Queen gets swamped and sunk. There we are. It's the end of it.
The book ends it differently, and is it a happy ending? Do they get blown up? Do they get the German boat or not? Does it torpedoes work? There's a lot of different ways you can go with it.
And as Peter Vertel quoted William Wyler, and he said, William Wyler said, everyone comes to me with a good beginning, but what's hard is finding a good ending.
Sam Spiegel definitely thought that they should somehow pull this off. Houston, being true to his beautiful loser's ethic, was probably adamant that no such thing should happen.
I don't think he would have had them hung, but I think he would have had them possibly drowning when they hit the water.
I think until they were actually rolling, it didn't occur to any of them that this was a comedy. And I think the person who realized it with the keenest appreciation for it was Huston. Once he perceived the chemistry between Bogart and Katharine Hepburn, I think the reason that the ending got rewritten in Africa was because of that. And he just thought, no way. Can't kill him. Can't kill Rosie and Charlie.
You fight a lot to make a good picture, but the greatest enemy is your own preconception. You have to go with what could change and what's there. And I think it's very tempting to take it easy and just rely on what you can do well, but you have to fight it. And that's why unlikely assortments of people, you find them lugging a 3-strip Technicolor camera through the Congo and getting malaria. It's an extraordinary thing.
Don't you understand, Charlie? I wouldn't want to go on to Kenya without you.
Then the river ceases to be, they're now coming into the marshes for the great shot of coming out and revealing Lake Albert.
We had a wonderful carpenter called Harry Arbour, who John loved, who had to build this extraordinary ramps and get which was a very heavy camera in those days, the 3-strip Technicolor camera. And this was John's idea. It was his idea to get the shot. They managed to build it and shoot it.
The Lugard was sort of luxury compared to what we had done because there were cabins. I think some of the electricians had to double up and what have you, and triple up. But anyway, we all fitted in.
The ship we were on, the filter on the water, which we drew from the lake, whatever we were shooting on, wasn't there. It had disappeared. We were drinking pure lake water with the droppings of hippos and crocodiles.
So they got absolutely every single disease known to Africa.
We were all sick, very, very sick. All kinds of dysentery, all kinds of vomiting, everything.
There was an incredible story of Katharine Hepburn being filmed, playing the organ, and then there was a bucket where she was throwing up every 5 minutes.
She was vomiting between takes, and it was always terrible.
And Jack Cardiff's concerned that she was looking green and Technicolor.
And if you look at the restored version, you can tell what was shot in Africa and what was shot in England, because Kate became so dehydrated that her face literally started to sink in.
The big joke was on me because I was rather self-righteous, and I thought, well, I'm traveling with 2 drunks. I better not drink anything. So I drank lots of the water, lots of the water.
Everything you're not supposed to do.
John never got sick. Houston never got sick. Bogey never got sick.
Because they never touched water, they only drank whiskey.
And I nearly died of the dysentery because the water was poison.
They finished up in Africa, and then the cast and crew moved on to London, where they filmed all of the scenes that take place in the water.
I wonder how much damage we've done.
Let's get the water out and see.
The scenes with Robert Morley were also filmed in London.
Wretched little man, what indifference. He's a Canadian. Doesn't he realize he's in this too?
And all of those people on the German gunboat, we have Theodore Bickel and we have Peter Bull and the others, that was all shot in England.
Sie scheint weiß zu sein. Was there a woman with you?
It was 3 scenes. One was on board this gunboat, to show their interior that was built. The next one was when we were about to hang them on the deck, and then in the water.
It was built on the lot, outside the Wharton Hall Studios. It was built on stilts, about 15 feet high, because it had to get above trees, so the deck was against the sky.
They have to shoot a lot of stuff in England, which is soft-pedaled in terms of the public.
Some people say 50% of this movie was shot in England. Not sure that it was that much. But for example, the water was so poisonous where they were shooting in Africa that no scene in which any of the actors or crew had to be in water could be shot in Africa. That was deadly. So all the scenes that involve water, or Bogart or Hepburn in water, were shot in the UK.
I swallowed half the river that time.
It was then the mock-up of the various mock-ups of the African Queen, both stern and aft, against blue screen.
Meaning that they would mat in the background. And originally, you did have some distortion on the Technicolor prints because you had bleed. That happened in the early blue screen years for a while with color. That was there at the time.
And the boat was on rockers. And during the storm, we used dump tanks with these huge gallons of water pouring down. And there were rain heads over the tank.
And you did have a miniature African Queen that was probably, I don't know, it looks to be about 5 feet. That was used a lot for going down the rapids and so on, where you'd cut to the long shot, but you'd intercut that with them on the craft, and you'd see all of this water coming over them with a blue screen with Bogart and Hepburn at the tiller there. There's a lot of those shots.
The famous leech scene was filmed in England.
Oh, the little beggars. I said to Bogey, surely you're this great, strong man. Just take a leech and put it on you.
Yeah.
They were repulsive looking. So he said, not me.
Hewson, in his perverse way, wanted real leeches to be used.
I don't suppose anyone who ever saw that movie can forget those leeches and Bogart's reaction to them, that completely convincing
He had
tremble.
that reaction quite naturally.
You know, he brought out a leech to show him, even though the leeches he put on him eventually were like rubber ones.
And before Bogey had to climb into the water, they were stuck to his back.
They just fall off. He was so bony, every move, nothing would stick to him. Finally, they got something that stuck, but it wasn't a real leech.
The scene is that he jumps out of the water and everybody gets rid of the leeches. But one look from Miss Hepburn means that he's got to go back in there again because you haven't finished pulling the boat. And we do one more shot, and John is over there and he's whispering to Bogey. When I hear John saying, Bogey, I mean, this bitch wants you to go back into the water, and you got these leeches, they're going up your ass. She's a mad bitch. He says, look, John, cut out the crap. I got 3 expressions. Which one do you want?
When the African Queen was shown to the distributors after it was finished, they hated it.
They said, oh my God, an unshaven Humphrey Bogart, he looks awful, and Katharine Hepburn looking her age, and they just said, we can't sell this.
They made certain suggestions to the Wolf brothers, who basically told them to take a hike.
John Wolfe said, no, I employed John Huston to do it this way, and I'm not going to agree to any changes unless he wants to make them. After that, there was no more to be said.
Sam Spiegel was so convinced about his movie that he was determined that it should qualify for Academy Awards.
In order to qualify for an Academy Award, the film must be shown in a theater in America, at least, for 1 week.
And everybody thought that was just another piece of folly.
We're talking about a booking at the 21st of December at this one theater. Actually, it was 2 days late.
They were as bewildered as anybody else by the size of the success, not only commercial, but also critical.
Most of the reviews and most of the audience response was very positive.
Do you remember the first time you saw The African?
Yes, at the Lowe's Commodore on 6th Street, 2nd Avenue. My father took me. Sunday afternoon, audience loved it.
And Bogart's acting there was all sorts of talk that there would be an Oscar nomination for him. He was up against kind of tremendous odds. There was Brando in Streetcar Named Desire. There was Frederick March in Death of a Salesman. Montgomery Clift for A Place in the Sun.
And he thought, there's no way in this company that I'm going to win.
Bogart was happy enough, I think, to get the nomination, but he hated the whole idea, all of the stuff you had to do to kind of promote yourself during it.
And there they were on the night of the Oscars, riding with Richard Brooks to the ceremonies. Brooks said to Bogey, what are you going to say if you win?
He said, I'm not going to win. I don't have anything to say. Don't, leave me alone. And Brooks said, well, just, in case you win, what would you say? He still doesn't want to have anything to do with it.
And Richard Brooks said, let me tell you what to do if you do win.
He says, you're going to walk down slowly. You're going to get there. You're going to take it. You're going to look at it. He says, I want you to look at it for a minute. It's going to seem like an hour. Take a whole minute looking at it. And then look up and say, it's about time. Bogart says, great, I'll do it. But he doesn't expect to win. So they call out his name.
And Lauren Bacall's voice could be heard throughout the Pantages Theater screaming, you got it, go up there. And he went up and was apparently so flustered that he couldn't remember the remarks that he had planned to make.
He thanks everybody in his life. He starts to cry. And he goes off. And Brooks said, what happened? He said, I'll tell you what, when you get yours, you do it.
Peter Vertel had a sufficiently amazing experience on the African Queen that he wrote his best novel, White Hunter, Black Heart, about pre-production on the African Queen and about John Huston, whom he calls John Wilson in the book.
The picture they were making was not the African Queen in the novel. But of course, everybody who knew anything about this thought it's the African Queen.
At the end of writing it, Vertel showed the manuscript to Huston and said, if there's anything that you don't like, I'll take it out, I'll change it.
Peter Vertel is waiting, wondering, what is he going to say? Because it's not what you'd call a rhapsodic depiction of the Huston character.
Huston, of course, immediately read the book and then proceeded to make suggestions to Vertel on how to make him even less flattering.
I think it was a pretty accurate portrayal of Huston's relationship with Spiegel.
And that became Peter Vertel's masterpiece. It's quite a wonderful novel. And there was eventually a movie made of it, where Clint Eastwood played John Wilson and also directed it, White Hunter, Black Heart.
After such an incredible film, why did Huston and Spiegel fall apart? Because it was over money. When the reviews came out for The African Queen, and they were sort of best film ever, and then they were on good terms when Bogart won his Oscar for The African Queen. And then Spiegel kept on saying there's no money, darling, there's no money, and everything.
Spiegel did some maneuverings with the finances, and John's manager told him that this could get tricky, and you could end up going to jail over this. And John said, I want nothing to do with it. Dissolve my company with him. I want nothing to do with it. I don't want any more money. Whatever I'm getting paid, get me out of this quickly. And he did. African Queen goes on to make a ton of money, and Spiegel gets it all. And John regretted that. He says, I could have been a very wealthy man, he says, if that happened.
Huston was horrified and really angry to hear that Spiegel's then wife was wearing diamonds at Les Ambassadeurs, and Spiegel's second wife said, it's all the African Queen, it's all the African Queen.
I'd just finished a film called The Magic Box, which was a high prestige film. We worked on it on the basis that we all got half salary and the rest we'd get from the box office receipts, And as it happened, it was a very nice film, but it was a financial flop. I don't know why. So the next film was African Queen. And when Sam Spiegel, the producer, said, Jack, how about taking a little less salary and get a piece of the film? And I said, no, Sam. No, thanks very much. I've done all that. And I turned it down. I would have been a millionaire because, even 1 or 2% of the takings of that picture, because it goes on year after year.
Everybody loves African Queen. It's just one of those films, just two people on a boat. And yet it's done in such a way that you like these characters in the end. You see how they could come together from completely different parts of the cultural world.
Ain't nobody in Africa, except yours truly, can get up a good head of steam on the old African Queen.
I'm looking at it now, almost 60 years later, but it feels fresh in a new way. And I think the beauty of the film and the sense of how it was made, craftsmanship, has become even more impressive.
A great little film which became a masterpiece.
This is a compulsively watchable movie with two great cinematic performances and a terrific story, and you care deeply and passionately about what happens to Charlie and Rosie.
Rosie! Rosie!
It has a kind of an aura about it, and you don't really remember a particular event so much as just the chemistry between these two stars, and you wind up using words like magic, which don't even mean that much, but if you see the movie, well, they make sense.
Ain't a thing I can do about it.
We know it worked in 1951. We know that people flocked to see this and were delighted. But the fact that here we are now, and it still works for people.
I think because of the relationship of Bogart and Hepburn, the humor between the two of them, the sexual attraction between the two, and the fact that they're not matinee idols, this is something that will never date.
I know in my heart that the photography was pretty straightforward. There was nothing very, very artistic, nothing creative, nothing to say, oh, isn't that wonderful? Just ordinary photography. But the fact that African Queen is one of the most seen films, it's one of the most popular films, everyone loves African Queen. Ipso facto, you photographed the African Queen? Wonderful. They give me credit, which I don't really deserve, because it's an ordinary bit of photography.
When my son was 6 years old, this may have been the first Bogart movie he saw, and there was a period of about 2 months where he just watched it, because he loved the adventure, he loved these characters. And it's so interesting is that a 6-year-old would take the same pleasure that I did watching these folks, because the story is so great.
It doesn't pretend to be highbrow. It's not a highfalutin movie. It's a movie about two losers who get together and win.